Just give a quick update, and then I'll obviously take some questions. We did several, as you guys know, we passed a lot of pieces of legislation out of the House this week. A couple of them, and one especially that we talked about before session, but the crime package, those 3 bills that we passed dealing with the 3 strikes, looking at some judicial review and also bail reform. Obviously, we did those yesterday on Wednesday, and so that was a priority we laid out before session started. And you see we even had some bipartisan support on some of those pieces, so that I think that shows that we're on the right path, trying to make sure Iowa's a safe place. Also looking at our MAHA legislation, we felt that was something that was really important. Continues to be a topic at the federal level as well, and a lot of aspects of that bill, whether it's nutritional requirements, looking at some of the pieces with added physical activity in our schools. So we're pretty proud of several pieces of legislation that we passed, but I'm sure you guys have questions on a lot of different things, so I'll go ahead and open it up.
On the tough on crime package, any idea what the prospects are in the Senate? Have you had conversations with your counterparts over there? And then how do you respond to concerns that this will add to jail or prison overcrowding and concerns from defense attorneys, prosecutors who raise issues with the bill?
Yeah, I would say, so first of all, from the standpoint of with the Senate, we've had conversations. I made Senator Clemish and the governor's office aware that on our Monday morning leadership that would be a bill that we plan on bringing up this week. So we've, I made sure they were aware of that. They know it's one of our priorities. So we'll continue those discussions at the leadership level as well as the member level. And ultimately, when it comes to a lot of the argument focused around the cost. And I think from our standpoint of what you saw, if we have to invest more to make sure Iowa is a safe place to live, we're comfortable in doing that. And we don't think that the excuse because things would be too expensive is a reason to not make sure that we're locking up career criminals. And so from our perspective, if that's a place we have to invest dollars as a state, we think that's a good use of our resources. And keep in mind that in some of this conversation, we're not looking back, so it's going to be a forward-looking thing. And you're not going to see this just change overnight, but we want to make sure that we're starting this thing out so that way everyone knows that Iowa's a place where you can't just come and be a career criminal, but the impacts that you see in some of the fiscal notes and the conversations are not going to be on a day one basis either.
Do you accept the fiscal note? Because Representative Holt had some really strong words implying that maybe the Department of Corrections inflated the cost. Do you agree with that?
I think that there was from the standpoint of there may be some, what we saw as some inconsistencies in there. If you look at some of the costs with other states, let's just use like adding prison population, for example. Some of the estimates that were in there, if you want to add a bed for prison, were almost double of what we've seen with some of our neighbors that have recently done projects. So I would just say that was part of it, just questioning what those numbers actually equal. We appreciate getting the fiscal note, but again, when it ultimately comes back to what's a priority for us, and we've always kind of budgeted that way, we're going to meet those priorities, and over the next several years, we have that runway to do it the way we've implemented this bill.
Can you give an update on abortion medication and when that bill was pulled from the legislature?
Yeah, I think it's still something that we want to work through. Obviously, and I've said this several times when we've had these conversations, we're a pro-life caucus. This was one of our pieces of pro-life legislation to make sure black market pills were not getting in the hands of women in the state of Iowa, to make sure they were being protected. At this point in time, just working through potential amendments that may be on that bill. So it's something that I think we still would like to try to make progress on the issue, but right now, as many other bills as you saw on our blue calendar this week that were released, not all of them were in a position where we were ready to move forward on them.
Almost 2 months into your session, how are your top 2 priorities, eminent domain and property tax going? Do you have anything approaching a deal?
As far as an overall deal, I would say, on the property tax, well, both pieces probably the best way to answer this, Kay. On property taxes, I think we're making good progress from the perspective of us trying to incorporate pieces of the Senate as well as the governor's piece of legislation. We all understand, well, I understand, Representative Norman understands, we're not going to all get everything we want in this process. We're kind of getting to that point as funnels start to wind down, as policy starts to come off the floor. The tax pressure is going to start building us in these tax conversations. I feel like we're in a really good position, especially over here on the House, making, our bill, we came out with something that's very simple, easy to understand, but at the same time provides certainty for taxpayers. So we feel good about where we're at. And again, we're working through what those other pieces were. As far as eminent domain, still hopeful that we would see something come from the Senate, regardless of what that is. I mean, I'd love to see our bill sent down, but if that's not to happen, see a piece of legislation come back so we can continue to work towards finding a solution.
During the Senate subcommittee hearing on Dawson's bill, there was a lot of pushback on the gas tax on the Simmons bill, and then there was quite a conversation today about a tax increase on each of those. Do you guys want to raise taxes?
I think, well, part of it, I think that's two separate questions. Make sure I answer the second one on NCOs in case I miss it, in case I get, I can get myself rolling a little bit here, so make sure I come back to that. But from the gas tax, I think if we're going to have that conversation, it's an appropriate conversation to at least entertain. Now that doesn't mean I think on the House that we've made any decisions. Obviously it was in the Senate bill, not in ours. But we've been at least willing to have that discussion. The reason being, we do recognize that there are going to be, if we put income restrictions on our cities and counties, we do recognize that we feel roads and bridges are a critical need that are out there for Iowans, and that's a service they should provide. So I think it's an appropriate conversation to have. As far as where we've landed, I would say we haven't landed in a set spot yet. On the MCO tax, I talk about this almost every meeting we have, especially leading up to session, but looking at the amount of dollars that it's costing us in the state of Iowa for Medicaid, looking at the current shortfall with around $70 million, looking at what next year's number is, having a continued shortfall. Out 5 years, you're looking at a roughly $600 million shortfall. I think this is an appropriate thing for at least to us discuss, because, and I bring this up, you'll remember way back in the day when I came in here, when you were 25 when I was elected, I think, if I remember right. But when I was elected in 2008, about 13% of the budget went to Medicaid. Right now we're sitting around roughly 13 to 22% where we are now. And so that just shows the amount of pressure that we have on our budget. So I think it's an appropriate conversation to have on the second piece as well.
On the Senate property tax bill, local governments said that they appreciated enough time that revenue capped inflation. Are you open to negotiating more flexibility on including that?
I would say from where we're starting at in a position from the House's perspective, I don't want to be in a position where we're having too much flexibility in this bill. Our objective since the beginning of session has been making sure there's certainty for the taxpayer. I think for the last several years, and more than several, you've had certainty always exist for the taxing entities. By building in sort of a mechanism like that, I think you're putting yourself in a position where you still are not providing that certainty for the taxpayer. That's been our objective since we started this conversation. I think that's why we came out with the 2%, the 2% hard cap. I know the governor has a 2% hard cap in hers. I think it's going to be very difficult for us to get ourselves in a position where we're giving certainty again for governments and not the certainty for the taxpayers.
In the MAHA bill, there was originally a provision taxing tobacco flavored products that was taken out. I understand that your caucus was interested in a bill sponsored by Representative Parker. Do you know where that bill is at? Is there an appetite in your caucus to still take up that issue?
And I think it gets back to ultimately Kay's question that she asked earlier. We, as Republicans, there's a lot of revenue enhancements, tax increases that are out there right now. We're trying to decide what are ones that make sense and which ones are that are appropriate and which ones are necessarily needed. The advocates will say that's also one that ties into the Medicaid conversation, back to what Kay asked earlier. So we recognize that. But at this point in time, especially with some of the things that have gone on in the Senate with that proposal, I think we're kind of in a holding pattern on that. I think some of the other ones probably are where more serious conversations are taking place, but we're also a long ways from the end of session too. So you guys will probably not get me to say never on really anything yet until we get closer to the end.
Can you address Representative Wickendall's comments that the message coming from this legislature is that you don't want transgender people in Iowa? I mean, there have been a lot of bills the last 5 years targeting transgender people. And in addition to this one that we just heard, one earlier this week about, there was one in the subcommittee this morning related to foster care. So, I mean, how do you see that? This is a very small population and yet a big focus of the legislature's work.
Well, I think I'll just use today's bill for example. When we look at that, making sure that we're having consistency in our civil rights here in the state of Iowa, we think is extremely important. We don't want to have a different patchwork. We've spent a lot of time in the legislature. You're right, Laura, we have spent a lot of time, but a lot of those things that we spent time on were things like making sure that people were using their appropriate bathrooms. We didn't have boys and girls sports. A lot of our time was spent on things that we feel Iowans wanted us to do. And this bill is a reaction to that. If cities are going to start thinking that they can skirt around the state's laws and start creating their own patchworks, that's not what we spent all that time doing. So I think they kind of play into each other, that yes, we spent a lot of time on those, which we think that Iowans have supported. And now at the same time, if they're trying to get around all those efforts, we also have to continue to react. So that's not the message from our standpoint. The bill we had earlier in the week was, a lot of it was continuing to empower parents. You're seeing across the country where parents are under threat if they don't want to use certain pronouns and do some of these other things that I think that we're seeing, especially in other states, but we don't want it to come to Iowa. We want to get out in front of some of those things. So I think, and hopefully I answered your question there. But that's what I think
are
we ultimately
transgender
see.
people welcome in Iowa?
I think,
Can you address
I think,
that?
I mean, I think Iowa's extreme. There's a reason why we're called Iowa nice. I think everyone is welcome to be here in Iowa, but at the same time, like this bill today was looking at cities that don't want to follow the state law. We do that on a lot of different topics. You know, when we banned plastic sacks over in Iowa City, that was a perfect example. We've done these kinds of pieces of policy before. It just so happens to fall in this category.
The Charlie Kirk teacher bill did not come up for debate this week. Could you provide an update on that?
Yeah. So on that bill, there was a few different pieces to that. There was a couple other that were part of that conversation as well that didn't get as much attention, looking at student walkouts and other things. But I think as we went to caucus on that bill, and I think I said this even way back when the assassination happened, there is a process in place. We want to see if the process in place is going to work. I think we ultimately kind of concluded as a caucus that a lot of the processes that are currently in place to make sure teachers, for example, in this instance, are following their school handbooks and their school policies. It looks to me like through BOE and all those that has kind of worked itself, and the mechanisms in place worked. And so I think from our perspective there is that in place. They seem to have worked in this instance. So at this point, we just decided we're not going to move forward with that at this point.
Last one. This coming week is revenue estimating conference, right?
Yeah.
I know as a former budget person, you're probably excited about that. Are you concerned that you might not get a clear signal for the whole fiscal year because of what's happening in Iran and how that might affect the economy?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of hard to tell. Like, for example, in fact, I just looked at I haven't had a chance to really look at my phone, but I see corn was up 10 cents today. So just not knowing what the volatility is. Usually the revenue estimating conference does a pretty good job of looking at some of those. Yes, those are more recent occurrences. But we'll continue to budget the way we have traditionally, making sure that we're funding our priorities, but also looking forward at what some of those potential uncertainties would look like. And it kind of gets back to our other conversation. It's why we have the cash reserve. It's why we have an ending balance. It's why we have the taxpayer relief fund for some of those unforeseen things. So we'll just see what that number looks like, and maybe next week I'll have a little bit better feel on what that may look like moving forward. So, thanks, guys. Yep, thank you.